Hello and welcome back to Moaning. If you guys are new here, then what is up? My name is Erica. Hey, how you doing? Now today marks the second episode in my series called A Case for Troy. A Case for being an ongoing series here on the channel where I deep dive into famous film and TV adaptations from the ancient world. Now, before we can get into the meat of today's episode and get into some analysis of the film, please do not forget to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. Now that you've all kind of done that though, today's episode will be about the lack of Greek gods exhibited in the film, and we will be questioning together as a family whether the story is worse off for their exclusion. So with that being said, let's dive right in. I wanted to open this episode today with actually the quote that made me want to create this whole video in the first place. And that way, if I read it out, then I'll set the tone for today and you guys will know why I wanted to create my own episode rather than just including all of this analysis in the character episodes or the set design or whatever it happened to be. It deserves its own episode because when the Hollywood Reporter published, when the film came out, when Troy came out in 2004, when the Hollywood Reporter published their review, it included this really thought-provoking sentence. So I'm going to read that out for you guys. And it said, to remove the gods from what is, after all, a Greek myth is to gut your story. And it's because of that I decided to make today's episode a little exploration and seeing if Troy really did gut its story by removing the gods. As you know, if you are up to date with the mythology that I posted in the first video of this series, and also I then created its own separate video in case you guys just want to watch that. If you guys have engaged with the mythology, whether it be on this channel or in the actual source material, you will know that there is a plethora, that's incorrect grammar, there are a plethora of gods in the Iliad. But the question today is it possible to tell the story of Troy and remove the gods, but still tell the story effectively? And further, did Troy actually manage to do this? So for this episode, I will be taking you guys on that journey with me. There will be a teeny tiny discussion about the mythology because there are just some things I need to catch you up on in regards to the background of the gods and how they work in Homeric poetry if you're not familiar with that. Then we're going to lead into the explanation actually of a debate that's currently happening in the classicist community. We're going to get really, really nerdy so that you guys understand that. And then we will be figuring out if you can actually then remove the gods and how the film has done so, what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are, and coming to a conclusion together as a family. But first things first, we got to do the mythology chat. So let's get you all up to speed with the gods in Homer. So if you watched my first video where I dove into the mythology of Homer, you will know that the gods play a huge role in the unfolding of the Trojan War in Homeric poetry. And subsequently, that means that then the gods are vital to the battle itself. The majority of the action in the Iliad is pushed forward by the gods, with different deities helping out their allotted sides. Okay, so gods do take sides. On the Greek side, we have Poseidon, Hera, and Athena. And on the Trojan side, we have Apollo, Ares, and Aphrodite. So they are fighting for different sides the entire book. Now, to oversimplify this massively, I'm totally aware if there are other classicists who are watching this, they're going to be like, Erica, you've missed out a lot of detail. I know. But to make this very, very simple for you guys, the gods really help out in three main ways throughout the text. Okay, so we have gods that get into chariots, we've got gods that are foot soldiers, and then we've got gods that are more so what I call like savior roles, protector roles. So these particular deities do not actually get down with a sword and like fight anybody on the battlefield. They're more so doing the fighting behind the scenes. They are picking characters up off the battlefield, bringing them elsewhere, or they are chatting to gods like Zeus and trying to get the war weighted in certain ways in order to help the characters. So they're fighting more so behind the scenes. That's what a savior or protector is doing. With all that in mind, for the Greeks, we have Athena, who's the charioteer, Poseidon, who's the foot soldier, and Hera, who is our savior or protector role. And then when it comes to the Trojans, we've got Apollo, who's the foot soldier, Ares, who's the charioteer, and Aphrodite, who's more so the savior protector role. And I do just want to put a little disclaimer here right now that in the Iliad, these roles do cross over massively. There are times when Ares is a foot soldier, when Apollo does get into a chariot, all of this sort of stuff. So I am aware that there are exceptions to this. I am again oversimplifying this for you guys who have not read the Iliad. So let's just take it as sort of three different categories. It just makes this a lot. I promise you, I've tried to explain this in multiple different ways, and this is the one that has worked on all of my friends. So we're just going to go with that. To make this even more clear, I will give you guys examples. So in book 5 of the Iliad, we see both Athena and Ares in chariots. So Athena gets down into the chariot with Diomedes. She's in the form, obviously, of a regular mortal on the Greek side, but Diomedes can see her. Diomedes doesn't have mist in front of his eyes. Anyways, so he's in the chariot with her, and then they go in advance on Ares, who is on the battlefield, and then Diomedes stabs him in the belly. So that is 2 examples of charioteers. Then if we go to the foot soldiers, Poseidon is constantly on the battlefield. I think it's book 11 or book 13. I didn't make a note of this. This is all off the top of my head. But in 11 or 13, with both of them, that Poseidon is actively on the battlefield with the Greeks, rallying them up, going into war with them, all of that sort of stuff. And when it comes to Apollo, we see him in book 22, right before Hector dies, that Apollo comes down in the form of a different Trojan to distract Achilles on the battlefield so that Hector has enough time to get the courage to actually go and fight Achilles himself. Lastly, when we go into our savior roles, we've got Aphrodite, who famously in book 3, she saves Paris from his fight with Menelaus. There's a moment in there where Paris is basically going to get choked to death, and so Aphrodite frees him from that and brings him back to Troy. And then we have Hera, who's also a savior, and famously in book 14, this is one of my favorite scenes from the entire Iliad, but she basically decides she's gonna look super hot and she's gonna hook up with Zeus. Yes, you heard that correctly. She's gonna go and have sex with Zeus so that way he's distracted, and it gives Poseidon enough time on the battlefield to rally up the Greeks so that they can go and fight the Trojans and gain some land, because at this point Zeus is on the side of the Trojans. So that is Hera's behind the scene fighting happening. She's gonna go and hook up with her husband, and hopefully he'll be tired enough afterwards that he'll fall asleep. It's hysterical, you guys. But anyways, that's an example of a savior. So as you guys can see just from those examples, there's a lot of godly intervention in the Iliad. Now, it's because of this that the lack of gods in the film was a real sore point for many, many people when watching the film Troy, including that reporter from The Hollywood Reporter, right? Now, this is not only because the gods are plot devices and, they are characters in their own right, but they also offer a lot to the story. They push the story forward and they elevate it from a mortal level to a more so mystical and fantastical story, right? So they're the ones who make it epic, shall we say. We've got the gods that come down and they fight. That's amazing. So I have no doubt that this is where The Hollywood Reporter was coming from when they claimed that the story was being gutted by excluding the gods. However, this may have been a little bit of an over-exaggeration, a little bit of an overreaction when I tell you about the debate that is currently happening in the classics community with regards to the gods in Homeric poetry. The academic community has been divided for quite some time about the function and role of the gods in Homeric poetry. Now, what I just explained to you before with regards to the mythology of the gods physically coming down and doing something, literally the gods having an active character, an active role, only half of classicists believe this. Okay, I would say probably the majority of classicists believe this, where they think it is literal. Okay, so the gods, when I tell you that Aphrodite is coming down and saving Paris, that is literal. When Athena gets into the chariot of Diomedes, again, literal. However, the other school of thought believe that the gods are not actually doing these things, but that the gods are metaphorical in Homeric poetry. So this school of thought believe that the gods are merely embodying the characters' more so emotions and inner turmoils, and it's more so a physical, embodiment of what the character is going through based on what God helps them. So I know that to those of you who are not classicists, who are not as familiar with the ancient source material, that might be a little bit confusing. Let me break that down very simply by showing you that with a scene. So if we use the example of Aphrodite and, coming down and helping Paris and Menelaus, that's a scene that happens in the film as well as in the source material. I'm just going to use the example of what happens in the Iliad. So that scene, for you guys who don't know, is Paris and Menelaus decide to face off Helen's husbands against each other, that whole shebang, and they just want to fight it out and end the war there. Now, when Menelaus is fighting Paris, he is clearly going to clobber him, at least in the book, okay? It's very obvious. Menelaus literally gets his sword and he's whacking Paris's helmet, the whole shebang, and he starts realizing that the gods are on Paris's side. So Menelaus gets really frustrated and he leans forward and he grabs the horsehair on the top of Paris's helmet and pulls him to the ground. Menelaus then turns around and he starts dragging Paris behind him by the helmet, but the helmet has a chin strap. So Paris is getting choked by this chin strap as he's being dragged along the ground. He's about to be clobbered by Menelaus, and that is when Aphrodite steps in and she comes down onto the battlefield. She cuts the chin strap of Paris's helmet, picks him up, and brings him back to Troy, where she then plops him in the same room as Helen and they have a conversation and they then end up hooking up at the end of book 3. So to the first school of thought, aka me, I also agree with this school of thought that when you read this scene, it is exactly what I just described to you. It is Aphrodite coming down, picking up Paris, saving him, because if she didn't, he would have died. That's it, right? That's as far as it goes. It is Aphrodite as her own being coming down, helping Paris and bringing him to Troy. However, the second school of thought see this exact same scene, and they see it as Aphrodite being a metaphorical embodiment of Paris's love for Helen that saves him from being killed by Menelaus, because he then goes and sees Helen. So Aphrodite is merely showing that the only way Paris got out of that fight is not from his pure power, because Ares didn't come down and help him, so there's no violence there. There's no battle strategy. Athena didn't help him. Aphrodite did. So it's his love for Helen that saved him in that scene. So again, to make this very clear, you have one school of thought that sees the gods as literal, and you have the other school of thought that sees them as metaphorical. If that doesn't make sense, if you guys still don't get it, please leave a comment below and I will try and describe it better or link you guys to relevant articles. I'm bringing this up because based on this debate and me knowing that this debate exists, and now you guys knowing that this debate exists, it means that I actually don't mind the idea of omitting the gods in theory. Okay, in theory, I kind of get it. Based purely on what I just told you, I don't necessarily agree with the Hollywood Reporter that the story is gutted by removing the gods. I do not agree that just because it's Greek myth, that taking the gods out is inherently gutting a story, just because of what I just told you. Okay, so based on that, we're just based on that classical debate, it is not inherently gutting a story just because it's Greek myth, okay? This is because that if the film still keeps the themes of the gods in there, so like I said with that scene with Aphrodite, you keep the love in there, you keep all those values, all of that sort of stuff with Paris in order to save him, that's really what matters. That is really the most important thing, because in that case, you are just honoring the secondary school of thought of academic communities everywhere, of classicists everywhere. You are just acknowledging this weird school of thought, which I don't personally agree with, but I know that it exists. I know that it's a debate, and therefore I can respect it. And actually, as I was thinking about this, so further than that, as I was thinking through this whole discussion, I actually do think that cutting the gods is a good idea from this story. It is actually I think it's a really interesting choice based on the modern world. I think that by cutting the gods, you are making the Trojan War a more mortal-driven story, shall we say. And I think that's a smart one based on the modern day world. Reason being is because that way you are making the characters much more relatable to a modern audience, and then you give the characters more agency, which is something that then people can relate to more, right? That is so important. And like Wolfgang Peterson, actually, now that I'm saying this, he did say, I'll include the actual quote on the screen because I can't remember what it was word for word, but he did say in some interview, like if Homer was alive today, that he would have supported the idea of the gods being cut. It was something like that. I can't remember. Again, it's popping up on the screen. But either way, I kind of read that, and after thinking about this debate, I was like, I mean, yeah. Look, the point of updating mythology and the point of updating these stories in general is to make them relatable to a new audience. And again, I want to make this very clear that as long as you're going to be hitting all of these beats of the stories and all of the important themes, you have full permission. In my opinion, you've got full permission to cut the gods. After all, it's the themes and not the gods that prevent the story from being gutted. As an aside, obviously, I do need to say that cutting the gods is unfortunate in regards to really strong characters, just because the gods are really cool, and we do get 3 really strong female characters from mythology. So when you make this more mortal driven, you're cutting out the only strong female characters from the whole Iliad itself. So, you're cutting Hera, what are the other gods? Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Am I a classicist? It's questionable. But you're cutting those 3 gods. So that is unfortunate. But production-wise, time-wise, I also understand why you would do that. So I immediately sort of shut down that thought, which is why I say this is an aside. Because, look, if you're going to include 3 more characters, then you're going to have to, especially if they're the female gods, you have to include the male gods in order to counterbalance them. That's just the way that the story works. So you've got to include those. And based on adding 6 characters, you then have to actually, go through them and develop them correctly. We're talking like probably another hour on the film. The film is already 3 hours long. We did not need another hour. We just don't need it. And also, bear in mind, you would have had to actually include Zeus. So it's a minimum of 7 gods being added. And a lot of the gods' action does not take place on the battlefield of Troy either. So by including the gods, we would also have to add minimum an hour onto the story, and then add on a whole sub-secondary story underneath the one that's already happening on the battlefield, because the gods are mostly seen on Mount Ida, or they're seen on Mount Olympus. They're seen chatting and bickering with one another. Again, we just didn't need it. I totally acknowledge that, because you've not only got to then pay for that time on set, you've got to then pay for the actors, you then got to have an extra hour of runtime. It actually does, from a film production point of view, make way more sense to just cut them. And again, I want to make this very, very clear. You can cut them based on all of that, as long as the themes are in there, as long as the values of the characters are in there, as long as the ideas are still being explored that the gods offered, right? So as long as all that stuff in there, as long as the characters, inner emotions and the turmoils, that's really brought to the front of the story, that's fine. It's not gutting your story in order to exclude them for that purpose. It makes the most sense, monetarily speaking, to cut them, and on the other side, the runtime of the film, I do get it. So yeah. Now, in saying all of that, obviously I have to vouch for the film first, saying I totally understand it, but when you look at the film and take into consideration what I just said of what they could do, what was a possibility, and what they needed to do in order to effectively tell this story, Troy does not play on the themes that were necessary to tell the story of Homer correctly. Now, in omitting the gods, the film does not make any effort whatsoever to hit the beats of the original story, nor the values of the characters. Let's just put that out there right now, because what I'm about to say is all incredibly, incredibly important. Even if you guys are fans of the film, we need to bear this in mind. And so I want to run through a couple of quotations for you guys, because what's really, really odd about this film is that they do kind of keep the gods in. It's sort of like half and half. So we do have references throughout the script as well. I'll be linking the script in the description below. But the script references people like Apollo, Poseidon, Athena, Zeus. A lot of them are referenced, and yet they offer zero purpose aside from decoration in the set design. I mean, there are all of these like throwaway lines and stage directions that reference gods in the script, but they act more so as like accessories to remind the audience of the time period, rather than having them actually be of use in the story, right, whatsoever. In fact, and here's something really, really weird, that every time the gods are mentioned in the film, their existence or their power or something or other is challenged by the mortals of the film, which is very, very strange, coming at it from a historical and classicist point of view, right? So now I'm going to read you some examples of that, because I can't say that big statement without giving you guys something to latch onto. So again, you can open the script below. I'm going to be telling you guys the page number of the script so that you can actually go and find it, as opposed to fast forwarding through the film. And obviously I can't go through all of them. There are lots of examples, but I've just pointed out for me some of the really, really weird ones. So Priam talks to Hector on page 38 of the script, and he says, "Apollo watches over us. Even Agamemnon is no match for the gods." To which Hector then replies, and he says, "How many battalions does the sun god command?" Okay, Hector. On page 52, Achilles then literally labels the sun god. They never say Apollo, by the way, but the sun god is Apollo. Anyways, he labels the sun god as their enemy, and then he chops off the statue of Apollo's head, which is shocking to anybody that knows anything about the ancient world. This was mind-boggling that this was included. But later, this continues with Achilles. He's got like a real weird atheistic mentality in the film, because later on page 60, after Briseis is being captured, she tells Achilles that the sun god will have his vengeance, to which then Achilles replies, "What's he waiting for?" Okay, but one of the strangest lines, that's not the weirdest one, because one of the strangest lines revolving around the gods is found on page 104, where Achilles says to Briseis, "The gods envy us. They envy us because we're mortal, because every moment might be our last." Now, I want to make this very, very clear to all of you guys that none of this, not even an inkling of this whole questioning of the gods, is bubbling in any corner of the Iliad, right? I support the idea of omitting the gods entirely and making your film centered around the characters battling their inner emotions and their turmoil, their will. I totally, totally support that, as well as obviously supporting the idea of creating a film that includes the gods in order to portray the complexities of the story. Obviously, right? All of that stuff is fine. But if you're going to include the gods, even a smidge, you need to understand the power that they held over mortal beings in ancient times. Because if the gods are present, which they are in the film, if they are present and mortals are challenging them, which mortals are doing in the film, you can best bet that punishments are going to be dished out left, right, and center. That is the whole purpose of mythology. Now, obviously, I did go through the Iliad to find any possible examples of disbelief in the gods throughout the poem, just because I do unfortunately want to make this as balanced as I possibly can and give the film the benefit of the doubt. And interestingly, I did find one time where a bird omen is challenged, and that's by Hector. But however, this is really important. He only challenges it because he has previously received a sign from Zeus, which is not what the bird omen says a little bit later on. And so that is why, right? Because the previous message he receives from Zeus is not in the form of a bird omen. And so Hector trusts that over the bird omen. Now, for those of you who don't know, bird omens are actually really common in mythology. They're a very, very common mythological trope, and they basically just involve birds doing really weird things, and then a mortal who is assigned bird reader, they read the sign and they interpret the meaning as a communication from the gods themselves. Interestingly, this does happen as well in historical source material. It happens a lot in Rome, also a lot in Greece, but a lot in Rome as well. So it does transpire between both Greece and Rome. And bird readers are very, very important. They're a really massive job title in religion in the ancient world. They are known as augurs. So that's spelled as A-U-G-U-R-S, right? They are very, very important both in mythology and throughout history. So this episode in book 12 of the Iliad is actually when the Trojans get right up to the walls of the Greek camp, and they are planning to go in and to try and take the ships. However, when all the Trojans are standing there, an eagle flies over them, and the eagle is clasping a serpent in its talons. Now, as the eagle flies, and the Trojans are watching this, as the eagle flies, the serpent starts wriggling a bit, and it manages to get its head up and bite the eagle above it. So the eagle is quite shocked by this bite, and it drops the serpent. The serpent drops right in front of the Trojans, and then it scurries away. Or scurries, that makes it sound like it has legs. It slithers away, shall we say. So the Trojans are watching this, totally shook, and this character called Polydamas, who is not in the film but is in the book, he turns to Hector and he says, you know, that is clearly a sign that we are the eagle and that the snake is the Greeks, right? Because we are right next to the ships. We think we're going to take them. We think we're going to take the camp. But this is an omen that says we are not going to do that today. So we should really just go home. Set up camp here, go home, sort it out, get, a good night's rest and leave it at that. And Hector, right after saying this, turns to Polydamas and he says, that is the biggest load of baloney I've ever heard. I got a sign from Zeus that told us that we were going to take the ships, so we should go in. If you think that I'm going to trust the idea that a fucking bird can tell me differently, you are out of your mind. And what's really interesting about this is that Hector is wrong, right? So when he goes into the camp and when he tries to burn all of the ships, when all of the Trojans try to get in, they do not succeed. So that's also a really interesting part of this, that it's the only time something is actually challenged, and yet Hector is still wrong. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because I do think that it's important to note that there is at least one challenge to religion in the Iliad. However, it's so important for you guys to know that this is not a challenge to religion itself. In this particular moment in the Iliad, Hector is not saying that he disbelieves in the gods. He's not challenging the gods themselves. He is saying that he trusts the word of a god over a bird sign, right? So it's more so that he's challenging the hierarchy of religious communication from the gods to mortals. So he trusts the word of Zeus over the stupid bird sign, right? So religion itself is always on the table, and it's merely the mode of communication that they argue about. Not that religion is not a thing, but just which communication do you trust over the other? Absolutely none of these men would have disbelieved in the gods or even flirted with the idea of saying it out loud. I mean, heaven forbid. They had more than enough signs and more than enough stories to suggest that one, the gods exist, and two, if they were to even come out and challenge them, there would be a massive punishment and repercussion for that. I mean, just the idea that the characters would take that one step further and verbalize those challenging thoughts, it just would not have happened at all, right? The idea that they would make fun of the gods' power would have not been a thing. Challenge them in any kind of, just eradicate that. I can tell you guys that if Hector challenged how many battalions the sun god, aka Apollo, had, Apollo would have come down and he would have struck him, right? He would have come down and killed him. He would have made him suffer in that way. that's what happens to people who even think about challenging the gods, let alone if Achilles, the idea that Achilles would bait Apollo into coming down and fighting with him is just, like, honestly, I'm getting flustered even thinking about it, because he would never ever do that. Apollo would slaughter Achilles on the spot and make an example out of him for all the other mortals who think of saying anything along this line. Now, yes, Apollo does come down and he does fight Achilles on the battlefield, but it's not because Achilles baits him. Let's make that very clear. It's because Apollo comes down in order to help Hector. There is at no moment where Achilles goes, Apollo, come down and fight me. Like, no, absolutely not. Apollo is sent down. Very, very different. What Achilles exhibits is more so atheism, and his apparent atheism, which is what I'm labeling it as, they don't obviously use that word in the film, but it is very apparent atheism, is the most shocking based off of everything that I just told you, because the idea that Achilles would say any of those things, and further that he would chop off the head of a god statue, is just baloney. You guys, this one action does not line up to any sentiment of Greek mythology, especially that of the Iliad. Again, with no repercussions, we need to bear that in mind. Achilles is not somebody who would do that anyways, but we're going to ignore that this episode doesn't happen, and we're just gonna say, let's say that it did happen. It would not have gone down this way. It just would not have been a thing. I mean, ancient mythology is you do something and then you get punished for it. Sometimes you don't even have to do anything and you still get punished. I mean, let's look at some examples of that. If we look at ancient Greek tales, right? Because ancient Greek tales have this very common theme in them that is completely common practice for gods to punish mortals. Again, for reasons that are valid and for reasons that are totally invalid. That is just part of the storytelling. The gods punish people for doing way less than cutting off the head of their statue, right? A perfect example of this is Cassandra. If you guys don't know who Cassandra is, the examples I'm going to give you, by the way, are part of the Trojan cycle instead of pulling from outside, because we can pull a bunch of them. But specifically in the Trojan cycle, Cassandra is a character who is the daughter of Priam, and she's also, she is known because she was cursed by Apollo. But how did she get cursed by Apollo? You might be wondering. So basically, she ends up, she knows Apollo, right? There are different versions of this, of how she meets Apollo. She's a priestess, sometimes she comes to contact with the god, whatever it is. Regardless of that, the whole purpose of this story is that she ends up making a deal with Apollo. And the deal is that he will give her the gift of prophecy and she will sleep with him, right? That is the payoff. And when Apollo gives her the gift of prophecy and then he goes, right, my payment is this sex, let's go for it, Cassandra backs out. Cassandra says, nope, I actually don't want to do that. I've now got the gift of prophecy. I'm going to walk away. And Apollo says, okay, I'm not going to take away the gift of prophecy. That would be far too easy. Instead, what I'm going to do is let you have it, but nobody will ever believe what you have to say for the rest of your life. Now that is rough. That is a really rough punishment to read. And the reason why that's so rough is because you have to watch Cassandra as an audience member. You've got to watch Cassandra tell everybody exactly how they're going to die and exactly how Troy is going to fall, and yet everybody bats her off as being crazy. It is absolutely heartbreaking. But that punishment was only because Cassandra refused to have sex with a god. That's it. Another example of somebody who is punished for something that's seemingly not that important is actually Agamemnon. I know that everybody's going to be like, oh my god, is Erica seriously vouching for Agamemnon? I will for these next two examples, because he does a lot of problematic shit. We're not taking that away from him. However, he does two seemingly ridiculous actions that should not have been punished, and yet he gets punished both times. The first time I mentioned in the first episode that I talked about the mythology, which is when he accidentally, totally accidentally, goes into the forest and he shoots a deer that is sacred to Artemis. And as payment for this act, this completely accidental act, he has to sacrifice his own daughter in order for the ships to get enough wind to take them to Troy, which he does. And I want to say that him doing it is a totally separate matter, but the punishment is showing you guys that gods are willing to punish mortals for stupid shit. He killed a deer. He killed a deer that was sacred to Artemis. He's got to kill his own daughter, and he does it, which is awful. I cannot believe that he does it. Everybody reading that is always just like, are you actually serious that he would seriously do that to his daughter? He does. It makes him a terrible person. But again, the action, seemingly benign. The other example with Agamemnon that does also exhibit gods punishing mortals for seemingly stupid shit is when he takes the war prize of Chryseis, which is something I would like to remind everybody that every other man in the Greek camp has a female war prize. Every single one of them. And yet Agamemnon takes the wrong one. He takes a priestess of Apollo, and Apollo isn't happy. And so therefore he has to give Chryseis back because Apollo has rained down a plague on the Greeks for 10 days. The Greeks are literally dropping like flies. They are dying left, right, and center. And the only way that they will survive is if Agamemnon gives back this woman. But everyone else has a woman. Again, this isn't like he's the only one that took a woman and the god is punishing him being like, don't treat women that way. No, that's not the issue. The issue is that he just picked the wrong one. Again, we are not saying that Agamemnon is excused for him being an absolute shithead. He is absolutely not. But all three of these examples, Cassandra and both Agamemnon examples, are perfectly illustrating that gods will punish mortals for nothing. Because on the scale of disrespecting the gods, right, these are tiny. These are puny, absolutely puny little things that the mortals did that the gods got really fucking mad about. So the idea, this is what I'm coming back to, the idea that Achilles could chop off the statue of a god's head and have no repercussions. What? It is just utterly absurd that the god would not retaliate and that Apollo would just absolutely allow this to happen. I mean, it does not fit with the world that the film is set in whatsoever. And if you don't agree, if that hasn't convinced you, that actually Priam says on page 37 of the script, it's the will of the gods, everything is in their hands. And yet apparently punishment is not in the gods' hands. No, punishment doesn't happen. They just sort of sit around and they watch all this shit happen. They're like, oh, well, Achilles chopped off the head of... No! What? The point I'm trying to get at is that the underlying mentality of this scene is just some weird modern atheism, attack of the system type of mentality that's being imposed onto an ancient scene for the sake of it, and it makes no sense. And also, newsflash Achilles, just because I'm really riled up now if you guys can't see, that the gods do not envy mortals, right? He said that before, I mentioned that line, that it's just not a thing. That is not founded in any source material. The gods do sometimes, we'll be fair, the gods do sometimes fall in love with mortals, and they want to be with mortals forever. They want to stay with them and all this sort of stuff, but they certainly do not envy them for being mortals. I mean, I just illustrated for you guys that the mortals are more so like puppets, right? For the gods to have fun with. It's their mortality, actually. It's humans' mortality that makes them disposable and replaceable. And therefore, the gods can do whatever the fuck they want to them. Both good and bad. And therefore, it is very, very clear to me that David Benioff did not understand any of this when he was writing his script. Because if he did, he would have just omitted the gods entirely from the script and from the film in order to avoid any of this ridiculousness. And so to conclude this episode, now that I have calmed myself down off camera, that there was certainly a way for the film Troy to have not included the gods in their story without gutting the original mythology, right? There was a way for them to do that. This is not a we hate Troy because they didn't acknowledge the gods kind of episode at all, and I don't want it to be seen that way. But again, it is important to point out that what the story needed in order to align itself with the source material, like the values of the characters, the themes of the narrative, the ties to mythology, all of that sort of stuff, the acknowledgement of the time period, all of that, the world that this film is set in, none of that was met in this semi-godless rendition of Troy. And further, to have the scriptwriter, to have the director sort of pump their own modern views of religion and therefore atheism in lots of cases throughout the film, to have that in the film, it just undercuts the entire craft of ancient storytelling. Something that I always say to everybody is that it's easiest to understand the Iliad and just mythology in general as more so reading a fantasy world, right? So there are rules that need to be respected and followed in order for the story to make sense and for the world to work, right? So in the same way that when you watch Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, there are certain rules within that world that need to be kept, that need to be adhered and respected in order for the fantasy to work, in order for it to be magical. And that is the same thing with the Iliad, because yes, you can completely take out the gods and still have the fantasy world parameters in place. You can take the gods out and still keep the meaning of the story at the forefront of the film through the values of the characters. You can do this through the message of the film. All of that can be done, but you cannot have it both ways. You cannot include the gods, kind of, but then take out the active role of it and take out the meaning and take out all of this stuff. You can't have it both ways. You cannot have your cake and eat it. To me, as a classist, it comes across really lazy on the film's part that they wanted to include the gods in order to tick off the historical checkbox that the film needed, but taking away the values, the meaning, all of the importance, the themes of the story. taking away all of that just means that it looks silly. Because at the end of the day, that is exactly what the film did, okay? So they did not keep any of the values that are present in the mythology, and therefore, because they didn't keep the values or the meaning, they were removing the necessary fantasy world rules that were needed in order for the story to work. And so unfortunately, when I was coming to the end of, writing all of my research out and writing all of my notes out and figuring this all out, I did end up agreeing with the Hollywood Reporter that the story has been gutted with the half removal of the gods. The film Troy for me is the perfect example of the complete lack of understanding on the film production team's part that the gods and their power are devices that are used in the story. They are absolutely important to the understanding and the communication of this story and the meaning behind it. And they're not just some, random extra characters to be cut and manipulated in whatever way you think is going to make a bigger blockbuster film, okay? The mythology and the story, based off of everything that I just told you, has fundamentally been changed in order for Troy to exist. And so yes, actually, coming to the end of this, that I did agree with the Hollywood Reporter that the story has been gutted, but not because it is Greek mythology. The story has been gutted because the morals of the story have not been understood. So that was a bit of a heavy episode. I know that I had to address the elephant in the room, but yeah, thank you guys so much if you guys are still watching, if you guys listen to this whole thing, I really do appreciate it. And if you guys enjoy the content on this channel, I do have a donation link below if you guys want to help support me and support me creating all of this content for you guys to enjoy. So please head into the description below and check out the link. I have labeled it down there so you can go and find it. But thank you guys so much for watching this video, and we'll be seeing you next time with more videos analyzing the film Troy. So I'll see you guys then.